Everything else can wait, not agriculture. This was a phrase coined by India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm at the International Center for Crop Research in Semi-Arid Tropics, or ICRISAT, in Hyderabad, a center which works on so-called orphan crops, of which now Prime Minister Narendra Modi has given the new name, Shri Anna, meaning exalted foods, which is what they are. And I have with me Dr. Sean Mays. He is the head of crop improvement, not in a slow manner, but in an accelerated manner. So whatever you wanted yesterday, you can ask Dr. Sean Mays to give you today at least, if not in 10 years. He will tell us about millets. His own specialization is oil palms, and India is also indulging in oil palms, so we will also ask him about oil palms. Dr. Sean, at ICRISAT, what is the kind of research happening on millets?
So on millets, we're looking very much in terms of using their resilience and the fact that they're very high in minerals as a way to actually improve agricultural systems. So we focus very much on looking at a landscape level and trying to design agricultural systems that work, that sustain water, that provide incomes through value chains, and really using a mix of crops to add to the resilience of the whole system.
We are standing in a museum which has a large diversity of millets and certain legumes. And these are all both very important crops. In India, we used to use a lot of millets in our daily household food. In fact, I, as a child, grew up eating a lot of millets, and then wheat and rice kind of took over. So at ICRISAT, what has been the kind of research and how many varieties have been released, and has it helped many countries?
So since ICRISAT opened 50 years ago, we've released over 1,200 varieties, and that's in over 80 countries. So it's fairly international, fairly broad, and our impact is quite significant, particularly focusing on semi-arid countries.
Now, it is said millets are very smart plants. They can grow in very low rainfall conditions. They can withstand high temperatures. Why do you need to breed them if they are so smart themselves?
Well, because while they can survive well, and a lot of the land races, the traditional land races, do survive well, even on very, very small amounts of water, in the end, we need to have something that people want to eat, but also, obviously, yield and nutritional content are important components of actually having a healthy diet, but also being able to use the millets to produce value-added products, to actually provide income as well as stability.
So do you think as the world is warming up and the climate is changing, would we see the world embracing millets a little more?
Yes, I think we will, to be honest. I mean, I think wheat and rice and maize are all very important crops, and they've obviously had a great deal of research money spent on them to get them to where they are. But really, we have a lot of places in the world where actually it's very difficult to grow them, either because you can't provide the inputs they need, or in many cases now really because we don't have enough water. I mean, the growing material in the north of India at the moment is lowering the aquifers, and really that's not sustainable.
So you also worked in your personal capacity, not so much at ICRISAT, on oil palms. Mm-hmm. India is woefully deficient in edible oils. Mm-hmm. We import in lakhs of tons edible oils. Tell me a little bit about what are oil palms, and that India is going ahead with it. What is your feel? Will it be a way forward, or will we have to look at other crops also?
I think
So first about oil palms, what they are. Many people are not familiar.
so. Oil palm it's a relative of a date palm and a coconut palm, and basically it produces a couple of thousand fruit per bunch, and those fruit have a mesocarp that has a lot of oil in, and that's what's mainly used when you buy palm oil. So they're tropical and they're humid species, and certainly in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, they can yield quite significantly. Certainly 4 tons of oil per hectare is an average, which is pretty significant. And I think certainly the interest in oil palm is worth exploring in India. I mean, classically, it's considered that outside of 10 degrees north, you really don't sit in the oil palm belt. But my feeling would be, and I think it's true for a lot of crops, there will be places where it does work well, but it won't be everywhere. So I think it's really a case of identifying the best places to grow them, and then I think you'll probably get quite good yields. The biggest challenge is likely to be the dry period, and particularly the hot period when it's dry. They're not particularly good at that. Certainly the material that has been bred for very high yield is not good at that. There is material in Africa which might be a bit more suited. But I think it's a case of identifying where you do have good water reserves, or you can manage the landscape so that you have good water reserves.
Now, going forward and looking at the mandate crops of ICRISAT, which is where you are and in an important position, what is the future looking like? How can we get better and accelerated, which is your domain, crop improved varieties?
Well, I think certainly with the crops we have as mandates, I mean, one of the major step changes has been in terms of speed breeding. So by manipulating the light quality and the length of day, you can rapidly speed through generations. So an example that we've got here is chickpea, where we can actually do 6 generations a year. So that brings it down, so we could potentially go from discovery to variety in 3 to 4 years rather than 10. As well, we know a lot about the DNA, we know a lot about the genetics underlying a lot of these traits. So I think if we can pull everything together in a coherent fashion, because it takes it takes a new approach because it's very transdisciplinary, and learning how to do that takes time. But if we can pull that together, I think we can start to bring things through in a few years. I wouldn't say tomorrow. I'm afraid, at this point in time. But certainly a lot faster than it has been possible to do before. In addition to that, gene editing, which is making precise changes within the genome, is allowed now in India. And I think that will allow us to tackle a number of the problems that we really can't tackle through conventional breeding.
So how soon can we see a gene-edited crop emerging from ICRISAT or someplace and reaching the farmer's field?
Well, I would think that we'll have the first field trials of gene-edited material within the next couple of years. And then it's really a case of looking at how the overall crop behaves. So it's really gene editing is in addition to conventional breeding. It's not a substitute. But
Certainly. But there was a lot of hope from what is called genetic engineering. And India embraced what is called genetically modified. And it has been a runaway success. More than 95% of the cotton grown in India is now BT cotton or GM cotton. Does ICRISAT or Dr. Sean Mays have a view on genetic engineering and whether countries should go for it? I know Canada, Argentina, US have embraced it in a very big way.
Personally, I mean, I have nothing against genetic engineering. I mean, I think the problem comes in terms of, to some extent, who owned the technology, how it's been applied, the lack of thought about what you need to do in addition to making those changes. So really having adapted crops that work well anyway, and then you add an extra trait. And certainly gene editing, because it's a lot more precise, should be a lot more acceptable, but also it will be a lot easier to work with, certainly in India under these conditions that have been introduced for basic gene editing. In the future, I think it will be adopted, worldwide, because I think we face a real struggle to do what we need to do by conventional breeding alone. The ability to make small changes in otherwise very good material potentially allows us to bypass some of that breeding, not all of it, and also tackle things that at the moment, if we go through the gene banks and we look at the material that's available, we don't really have the sources of resistance or of a particular trait that we need. So in a way, we need to think about how we make it, and gene editing potentially can do that.
You're a Britisher, and the Europeans are kind of allergic to anything to do with GM or gene editing, and including, I think now Prince Charles is King Charles, who is rabidly opposed to anything to do with genetic modification. So you run against the flow.
I don't know that I run against the flow. I suspect, and I suspect Europe will probably change its rules quite soon. I think from a scientific perspective, and certainly from a research perspective, I actually think most researchers are in favour. It does need to be regulated, because obviously people could do things that in the end have really bad consequences to nature or whatever. But most of the GMOs that have been introduced into places like US have not really had significant negative effects. And I think if we can use gene editing, which is a lot more precise, we're in a much better position. But I think, whatever you do to food or food crops, you have to be aware that there could be a food safety issue. So I think you have to regulate it, but I think it will be accepted.
So would you think that using the precautionary principle in mind, if the way India has embraced gene editing, it would be a good idea for India to get these crops sooner than later into the field, and millets especially?
Yes, I think so. I mean, again, you have to introduce them slowly, you have to monitor them, you have to make sure there aren't any unintended consequences. But in the end, yes, because millets are very drought tolerant, they're very nutritious, but there are problems in terms of disease or other characteristics they don't have. So I think actually introducing them will allow you to understand more about what problems could be addressed. And I think having such crops in the field will make it become a lot easier in terms of future developments, particularly where we might be looking at things like herbicide tolerance as a way of controlling weeds.
So the world has depended on agriculture scientists to give us our foods. The digital world can never give us the food we eat. It can give you money to buy the food. So do you think you would be able to provide enough food for the vast population which is in India and in the world?
I think certainly crop researchers have a major challenge on their hands, particularly with climate change, where we're looking for more resilience as well. I think part of it is breeding. Part of it will be improving the resilience. But also I think it's about how we farm. And I think one of the things that we're very keen on here is looking at things in a holistic way. So if we can manage water, if we can capture water, it means we have more water available for the crops. So I think a more holistic, less uniform, the Green Revolution essentially worked because it bred for crops that were very wasteful. We can't do that anymore. We have to find efficiencies, and we have to have crops that are efficient.
So we need a greener green revolution?
Yes. I mean, I think it has been suggested we could have a second green revolution. But I think that
or an evergreen revolution?
Well, evergreen suggests it's a perennial, it lasts in the ground for a long time. I think it does need to be a continual process. I mean, I think partly because the environment is likely to change quite fast, we do have to be a lot more flexible than we have been with a lot of the original Green Revolution crops. I think as well that as technology changes and as our understanding changes, I think we will be able to tackle different things. So I think, as in conventional crop breeding, you can't rely on a single variety forever. It has to be replaced. And I think the same is true. It's just hopefully we'll be doing it in a more accelerated way.
And millets have a role?
Millets, I think, have a massive role. I think a very significant role in the future, yes.
So that was Dr. Sean Mace, a person who had worked on wheat, spent long years working on oil palms, something which India is interested, now looking at accelerated crop improvement for some of the orphan crops. He believes gene editing will play an important role in times to come, and he hopes not just the scientists, maybe the farmers and consumers could also be more acceptable to gene editing. But one thing many are very clear at ICRISAT: millets will be an important player as the world and the climate is changing and the world is warming up. They are smart crops. They were crops which were grown all over India in a big way. And with Prime Minister Narendra Modi calling them Shri Anna, and India declaring the year of millets, and the G20 presidency, and the United Nations also declaring it a year of millets, ICRISAT may finally find a bigger place for research and development of what used to be orphan crops and now called Shri Anna. At ICRISAT in Hyderabad, Pallav Bagla.